Thank you. Our intention for this, we know it's challenging figuring out schedules that work best for everybody, but we do want to make our discussions and deliberations as accessible and available to the public who might be interested as possible. So we do intend to post this video online, as well as for any task force participants who are unable to join, we can provide them with a link to this conversation. That we will send this link out to you all as well. That way it's a resource for you, as a lot of this presentation is going to have a lot of background information and data that I think will be helpful as we move into subsequent conversations around housing and housing strategies. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it back over to Beth. Our intention today is to provide you mostly with some good background information about a lot of the technical work we have been doing so far, and to let you know a little more about Wilsonville, and how Wilsonville has approached housing and housing policy here in the recent years. So with that, Beth, I will turn it back over to you to get our presentation started. A couple of other housekeeping notes. We do have the chat function enabled for the task force. We are going to pause at points in the presentation to answer questions, but if there's something that comes to mind and you want to go ahead and enter it in there, we'll make sure we address it when we get the chance. With that,
just
I'll turn it over to Beth.
One other housekeeping reminder, if you're not speaking, just because there's often background noise, could you please put your mic on mute?
Take it away, Beth.
I will take it away. So I've facilitated and presented at a lot of these kind of task force meetings. And when I find them most successful is when people feel like they can ask the questions they need to ask. So I severely encourage questions. Honestly, it makes the discussion and the project so much better. And if at the end of the project you come away understanding and basically, maybe not 100% agreeing, but basically agreeing with what we're coming out of this, then that puts you in a position to tell the Planning Commission and the City Council what you think. And you all have a lot of experience and bring a lot of richness to Wilsonville that somebody like me, a resident of Eugene, I can't have. So I want to start off that way and just say, if you have questions, ask them. We'll definitely pause. You can put them in the chat. If they're urgent questions because you didn't understand something, which is perfectly fine, just raise your hand. I tend to like taking things as I go along. So pardon me, I'm just adjusting all of my Zoom settings so I can still see you and show the presentation. As Kim said, today's a lot of me talking at you and to you, and it's a lot of information to absorb, and we'll come back to a number of the pieces of information in future meetings. For now, what we're looking for from you is an understanding of what we're doing, and basically understanding why we're doing it, and getting feedback as you have it now and later on the information we're presenting. This is not the policy discussion. The policy discussion comes next. Everybody gets all excited about the policy discussion. So, all right, our agenda is starting with the buildable lands inventory, talking about housing market and housing need in Wilsonville, talking about the forecast and land sufficiency within Wilsonville. And then talking about next steps, which will be taking us on to discussing the policy piece of this. So we're going to go over all of that today. I'm going to hand this to Kim, I believe, to talk about this slide and the next one.
Great. Thank you. I know for some of this group, you work in Wilsonville, you live in Wilsonville, and you understand kind of the unique, I think, housing story that we have to tell. But for those who don't, I just want to give you a couple of points of interesting context that I think will be useful to you as we work both through this presentation, but through the larger project. And so what this slide here shows is that we've really prioritized in the city of Wilsonville planning for a variety of housing types at a variety of different house points throughout the city's history. Notably, we've had over the years generally a fairly balanced mix of both single-family homes as well as multifamily homes. So really providing a balance of both ownership opportunities as well as rental opportunities in the city. And so I think what's really interesting about this slide, this is in one of our neighborhoods, the Villebois neighborhood, which is on the west side of the city. And this is a neighborhood that has built out over the course of the last 20 years or so. It's at the site of the former damaged state hospital and underwent a master planning process in the early 2000s. And so what's really interesting about these images is that these are different housing unit types that are all within 1/4 mile of each other. And they really illustrate the variety of housing opportunities that we have, both within Villebois, but then throughout the city as a whole. And so we have on the upper left, what is a multifamily project that is actually a subsidized affordable project that is blended into the fabric of the neighborhood, close to single family detached units and a variety of attached housing types as well, kind of a walk-up style townhouse, as well as a townhouse style that has a little more greenery to it. And I point this out, Beth, if you could move to the next slide. But this really illustrates a commitment to having neighborhoods that can meet a variety of people's housing needs at different points in their life, as well as at different price points. And so, as I mentioned, Villebois, the plan for that was developed about 20 years ago. But since then, we have, within the past 10 plus years, a constant focus on thinking about housing and how to keep planning for housing that is meeting the needs of our current population as well as that of future populations. And so this goes back to the last housing and needs analysis that the city did in 2014 that provided some background and context for what the housing needs were at that point in time, and really has led into some of the initial additional work that we've done with our master plans. I do see that Councillor Dunwall has a question, and so I will let you ask that before I go in.
Actually, very quickly before I lower my hand, I do want to go back to the prior slide, because I think that there's a really important element to bring in very early within this team, is that the photo in the upper right-hand side, I believe, is part of Cascadia Behavioral Health, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so what is really important about that is when we talk about housing needs analysis for all of our community, we are not talking about just necessarily affordable housing. We are talking about housing for everyone. And within the Villebois community, literally in the center of the community, is subsidized housing for individuals with behavioral health disabilities or concerns that they may have. So I want us all to think about this as a bigger picture of not necessarily just affordable housing, but affordable housing plus. Thank you.
Thank you for that additional context. Yeah, I think Villebois is a really unique neighborhood, and what we've been able to accomplish there, and really thinking about housing and providing housing in a different way than maybe what is traditional in a suburban context. So back to some recent planning for housing efforts. We've been doing a lot of master planning in the past 10 years to really set us up for the next generation of housing in Wilsonville. And so we've created master plans that are housing driven, both within our UGB expansion areas in the Frog Pond area, which is on the east side of the city, both through the adoption of a master plan for Frog Pond West in 2017, and then Frog Pond East and South in 2022. And that really is focused on opportunities for single family, detached, attached townhouses, cottage clusters, middle housing, with some multifamily units as well. We also have been working on looking at housing in more of a redevelopment and infill context in our town center area. And so this to provide opportunities for housing in proximity to retail, businesses, and services, really creating more of a town center here in Wilsonville. And so, really thinking at housing and how we provide housing on a spectrum of housing needs. We adopted development code amendments in 2021 in line with state requirements to allow for middle housing types throughout the city. And so we did that really thoughtfully, thinking about how we want to not only just allow these housing types, but in many ways encourage these housing types throughout the community. A big piece kind of in the middle of all of this is the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, which we adopted in 2020. And this is a notable milestone for us because for Wilsonville, this was the very first housing policy strategy that we ever adopted. And this was a project that looked at, not only regulatory types of strategies, but looked beyond regulatory strategies to really ensure that we are examining options for housing that will position Wilsonville well to provide housing opportunities, serving a variety of needs, both from a price standpoint and a layout standpoint now and in the future. And so the strategies that came out of that plan, they informed housing work that was done both in the Middle Housing Project and in Frog Pond East and South Master Planning, and also led to the project that a couple of y'all are involved in at our Wilsonville Transit Center. This is the project that will be breaking ground later this year. So, it's not just that we did a housing strategy, we did one with intention to really set ourselves up to pursue some unique and interesting strategies to continue providing housing. And so that's really a very short synopsis of how we've looked at housing over the past couple of years. I present this information because it is important context that the work that this group will be doing as we look at the housing projection strategy. Really that's an opportunity to see what we've done with equitable housing and how we want to build on that. And so I think, as we go through this work there, I'm sure you might have questions about some of what we've already done, and I can certainly be a resource to you if you do have those questions. So with that, we can pause if there's any questions on this work. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to Beth.
I don't see any questions, so I'll continue on. So you might ask yourself, why do a housing needs and capacity, an HNCA, and a housing production strategy? So you're trying to answer a number of questions. The first three are all in the HNCA. How much growth is going to occur over the next 20 years? Where's your buildable land? Do you have enough buildable land to accommodate growth? That's really what the HNCA is doing. It's also providing a lot of data, some of which we'll talk about here, to get to your housing production strategy, the HPS. And the shortest version of that is what policies are needed to meet Wilsonville's housing needs over the next 20 years, but the HPS really focuses on a 6-year period. It's a 6-year action plan, which we'll talk about a lot more in the next meeting. So I'm going to go back to what Councillor Dunwell was saying about this project being about all housing needs. And you can say that all households need housing that's affordable to them. What a household with a high income finds affordable is going to be different than a household with low income. We're also thinking about issues of equity, and we'll talk about equity a great deal more as we get into the HPS. But what are the unmet housing needs of people in your community who you rarely hear from? And so we've got a few folks on our committee here that have more direct contact with people who have unmet housing needs and are perhaps in marginalized communities. So we're trying as much as we can to bring those voices up and into this discussion also, so that we hear from a wide variety of people. So we're not just talking about one type of housing, we're talking about many types of housing and housing need.
Beth, I'm really happy that you brought that up, because I think that we always, as a team, we always need to keep top of mind that our marginalized community is most often our most silent community.
And that's hard. And we're working on making sure we can hear things. And this is, really building in a lot of ways off of what I understand that Wilsonville has been doing over the last few years around equity and building equity more into the city's policies, sort of beyond housing and beyond land use. So, all right. So what is this project? You've got your housing needs and capacity analysis. That's a technical report about all the things that are listed there. It's got a lot of data in it. It'll be, I don't know, 100 pages, and people who like data about housing will be delighted to read it. And other people, it'll be a bit of a snooze fest for them. Everybody's excited about the things that are in the housing production strategy. What are we going to do about it? So in the HNCA, we try to bring the data forward that we have, unearth the issues, bring up, fill in the data gaps with some qualitative data through engagement with different groups and different people to better understand what are the unmet needs in the community. So we use the term here, measures to accommodate needed housing. Think of that as policies or actions. The city is already doing a lot to accommodate needed housing. This will be looking at that, looking more deeply at housing affordability across the income spectrum, looking at housing needs for different demographic groups. So people with disabilities, for instance, people of color, other marginalized, historically marginalized groups. Then as soon as you're talking to planners and you start talking about development, you start to get into issues of infrastructure. So your water, your wastewater, your stormwater, your sewer. What do you need to have to make a place like Frog Pond developable? I know those are our community discussions, and they're hard ones because they cost money. And so then we get to the money piece, the funding option. If you want to support development of more housing that's affordable across the income spectrum, you also need to have money for that. You need to have money to pay for infrastructure. And if you want to accomplish things, you have to have some way of funding it. And so we heard, let's see, Devin talk about the Metro Housing Bond that Clackamas County works on. Well, that bond provided quite a bit of funding for housing issues of a variety of types. That's an example of a funding option. There's many, many others. So the housing production strategy is a 6-year action plan. It is not doing things like making the necessary code changes or setting up new housing policies or programs. It's identifying what code changes, what housing policies or programs need to be set up, because many of these policies, many of these programs are complicated and will require their own type of public involvement and discussion among your planning commission, among your city council to stand up those programs. So this is not the be all end all. This is more the beginning. And again, in 6 years after all of this is completed, the state will be requiring Wilsonville to go through this again, look at your housing needs again, evaluate how your housing production strategy has performed, look at what new policies are needed. We're also accounting for the city's existing efforts because you've done a lot. You need to be recognized for doing a lot. There's not an infinite amount that a city can do. But I think with creative thinking, there's a lot of things that a city can do, especially if we understand the barriers to accessing housing, to building housing, those kind of things. We'll be talking to you about all those things. So our engagement plan, we started working on this project last year, and we did some engagement last year. So we did a public survey last year about housing needs. We looked at what the preliminary results of the housing needs analysis were and presented that, I think, to the Planning Commission. We were at your block party last August. we did a rent burden public meeting with your planning commission and your city council, during which your decision makers presented some very interesting options that might or might not be in the housing production strategy. So stepping into this part of the project, we've got 5 meetings with our task force here. You all have quite a diversity of perspectives and bring a lot of information to the table. We'll be doing some stakeholder interviews, and that's really focusing on getting at what the unmet housing needs are, especially of marginalized communities. We've got what we are generically calling a culturally specific community event. We haven't decided exactly what that means, but that is intended to get to your marginalized populations as much as we can. We'll be working on that. We're talking about possibly doing a conversation guide, which is something where it's not led by your consultants, but it's led by people like you, maybe some of your other planning commissioners or city councilors, where you have this guide that you can go out to people you know, your friends and family. In another project, we had some church leaders who led discussion groups, where you're discussing these very issues with people who live in Wilsonville and have experience of how it's difficult to find housing, to keep housing, issues with housing condition, many other issues. So that's another way to get to another layer of people. And then there'll be an open house much later in the project where we're talking about housing strategies that we've already talked about with you all. So that'll be later on. Do you have any comments about about what we're doing on public engagement? I would like to say I'd always like to do more public engagement. We are bounded by the funds provided by the grants.
I see a gap.
Yes, ma'am.
So the gap that I see, and it's experiential for what we went through just recently on an advisory vote for the town center plan using urban renewal to fund some of the infrastructure, is that social media is where a lot of individuals receive misinformation.
Mhm.
And rather than, as public officials, we can't necessarily engage in social media, nor should we, because it is an echo chamber in many cases. But I have seen effective strategies where there are paid, very, very targeted ads within social media that actually can have defensible facts about housing needs and housing realities that can actually be part of a planned engagement. Have you considered any of that?
That may be something that city staff has been thinking about, but that's not something that has been under our discussions. Kim and Dan, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That's I think an interesting observation, having seen some of the same similar social media conversation on a variety of different topics. We are going to be working with our city communications team, particularly on the rollout of some of these more forward-facing engagement activities. And so that's certainly something I can bring up and ask. I know we do sometimes do paid, like you can pay to boost posts and get them out there. And so I think that's a tool the city has used before. And so I can consult with our social or our communications team that does the social media, because there might be just a little bit of information about the project that can be communicated that is factual in nature.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt can be a significant detractor, even when it's not based upon truths.
Mhm.
And given that, I think, annual block parties are great, public meetings are great, but often you see the same audiences attend those events. Those are audiences that may already go to the public library, may already complete surveys, may already, participate in city-sponsored events. The reality is, though, when it comes to supporting the realities of our housing issues in front of us as a city, that information may not be disseminated as fairly as it should be, I guess is the best way to place it.
I think that's I would say noted, and clearly a subject for discussion. Are there any other comments?
I would say that some of this stuff could be done in a way that doesn't require that much investment, because I am on in the algorithm of TikTok, I am on the urban planning TikTok algorithm. So there's lots of content creators out there that are making content that explain urban policies and the effects they have on livability and things that are very interesting. And it could be promoting some things that we agree with, that we need to get out there, that other people are already creating. It may not need new, fresh creation in the budget associated with that.
That's fantastic, Jennifer.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? Okay, I'm going to take us on then. So the role of your task force, you've already begun it. Providing comments about what we're doing. So the analysis in the HNCA, which you'll see here today. I won't be surprised if you have some comments or questions about the HNCA a little later as we go into the project more, when we've talked about what comes out of the HNCA. In other words, there's some complexities in the HNCA. You don't have the document yet, but you will at some point here. And it's fine if you've got questions later, or comments later, concerns. So then a lot of this will be about providing input on the actions that we're including in the HPS. So we start from barriers. What are the barriers to accessing housing, to building housing, to preserving existing affordable housing, to affirmatively furthering fair housing? What are those kind of barriers? What is the city already doing? And then what's the gap, essentially? What could the city do beyond what it's doing? And that's a difficult conversation in a lot of ways, because eventually you start talking about things that cost money. And of course, those are always difficult, and that's okay. But we'll need your help in selecting actions. And what we're hoping you'll be doing is thinking about the outcomes of the actions, so that we're selecting actions that will, if things go right, of course, generate the outcomes that the community is looking for. And then helping identify opportunities to build partnerships to support implementation of the actions. Because many of these things are things that the city can do partially on its own, but not necessarily entirely on its own. We'll talk a lot about what the city's role is in the housing development world, housing preservation world, in the next meeting. But certainly the city isn't anywhere near the only actor. There are many, many other actors, and you need to have partnerships to support some of what may be proposed in the HPS. And just so you all know, certainly we'll come with our thoughts about what may be helpful. Staff will have a lot of input on their thoughts, but undoubtedly we'll miss something that is important to you. And it's where we're hoping to get your input and bring it in. So the project schedule, this has to be completed by May 2025, because that's when the grant ends. Here we are working on completing the HNCA right now, starting to work on contextualizing housing needs. That's just a way of saying, taking the information out of the HNCA about affordability and demographics and that kind of thing, and filling in some of the gaps, and telling a clear story about what are the barriers to accessing housing and to building housing. We'll be looking at doing interviews with that and other events that we talked about. We'll be developing the strategies. We're not quite ready to, this is one that that builds a little bit slowly. We've given some ideas to staff based on what we know other cities have done, some of the best practice ideas, that kind of thing. And staff is mulling over those and thinking about what would make sense. And some of that will help us bring forward what we bring forward to you all. Maybe presenting some other ideas that may be good ideas, and then getting your input on it. And then we have to write the final and draft housing production strategy next winter. And then it comes more public by next spring. And then after the housing production strategy is completed and the city council has, had its input and adopts it, then the hard work of implementing it begins over a 6-year period. And then you start again. So before I go on to talking about buildable lands inventory, are there questions? There's many layers of detail that we'll get into more later.
Hey, Beth, could we pause for just a moment? We lost Councilor Dunwell at one point, and I want to be sure she has a chance to get re-promoted back onto the panel before we continue.
That is fine. It looks like Councilor Berry has a question.
Yeah, so I really appreciate how organized this presentation is so far. One of the concerns that I have, I know that we're looking to see what the inventory is and what future housing number of dwellings we need. But one of my concerns is for the people that are already here and living in multifamily, especially, so that I know that Miranda has talked about how rents have gone up. Big corporations have taken over a lot of the properties and they've raised rents, and people aren't able to stay in their housing. Although I think that on one hand, a lot of people in Wilsonville who live in multifamily do stay in the same building for many years. But one of the things that I would like to look at is to make sure that we're addressing the rents that are going up and the abilities for families to stay so that their children can continue in their school communities.
One of the branches of the HPS that I haven't talked about is anti-displacement. So housing stability. That's important both for renters and certainly for low-income homeowners also. So that's
with looking at strategies, or how far in depth would we do with this committee?
Well, I mean, an anti-displacement program could be its own action. Like there's many things that you can go into. I know we worked with Beaverton a few years ago on an anti-displacement strategy. So that's a very deep pool you could dive into. We have to find a medium way into the pool. And if it turns out that part of what the city needs is a deeper dive in the pool, then, one of the HPS actions might well be about taking a deeper dive into anti-displacement strategies. With particular attention to X, Y, or Z kind of strategy. So
make sure you put it on your list. Thank you.
Oh, certainly it's on the required list, so you can depend on definitely seeing that.
Thank you.
And I see Councilor Dunwell just returned to us. Thank you. Caroline, could I ask you to lower your hand? Otherwise I'll perpetually think you have a question. Are there other questions?
I'm
it looks like Jennifer has one.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the raise hand button. This may be a comment more than a question, but when I attend these meetings, I often feel like we're starting from scratch or that we're reinventing the wheel. And I just did a quick ChatGPT query about, are there any success stories out there of communities that have had low inventory that, were able to actually move the needle? And I got a ton of responses. I'd like to see some of that. I'd like to see some of the things that have worked in other communities that we might be able to piggyback on.
Yeah, and that's partially where we start.
Okay.
So we have given staff a memo that's, I don't know, about 30 pages. The Department of Land Conservation and Development has a separate list aside from ours, which frankly, they're very closely related, that one could delve into as well. What I don't want to do is overwhelm everybody on the committee by giving them that full list. Although if you want it, I'm sure we can give it to you. But a 32-page memo of, you know, cities done this and this and this and the other thing. That's a lot. So I think what we're hoping to do is, you know, take off the top 20 or 30 things, probably not 30, to bring into the discussion. In the end, you need an HPS that has the right number of strategies for you. And what's the right number? I don't know. But I would say I've worked with cities that have had 35 strategies. That's a lot to do in a 6-year period. I think it's more effective to have somewhere, you know, 10 or 15 is what I typically say. And those are just, that's, you know, it may be different for Wilsonville. But you've got, you know, the staff capacity that you have the funding that you have, plus anything else that might come up in the HPS. And so let's choose the strategies that make the most sense in Wilsonville's context. And I don't
Well,
know
and
right now.
And I think some of the information around where if these strategies have had results elsewhere, and the likelihood of success or the likelihood that they've results elsewhere, that is meaningful data for me.
Yeah. And so we've got some of that. We can't do a full analysis, a full case study set of analysis on what's been done elsewhere, but our colleagues, there's about, I don't know, a dozen to a dozen and a half of us here at ECHO who work in Portland, Seattle, across Washington, and then the Intermountain West, who, you know, do it from different perspectives. Some of them are looking at development feasibility, and some of them are looking more at long range planning. So we've got a good group here that we draw from. It's not just me and Nicole.
And if I could jump in and add real quick, if it is of interest to this group, I mean, first, so the memo actually, Beth, I think is like 45 pages. It's long, really long, and I'm almost done providing comments. But what I will say is a lot of what's in there are things that the city has actually already either examined or already done. So, you know, even the list that DLCD maintains, there are things that we've already done. So the city has done a fair amount already. And so it's, like you said, we aren't starting from scratch. In my own kind of personal time, I think there are other resources out there too. If people in this group are interested, I think we can certainly look at what we can aggregate and, you know, see. It does remind me, there was this book I read a couple of years back. I think it's called The Affordable City. I have it somewhere in my office. It too is another book that gets into a lot of different policies and how they've been used. And so, you know, I think as we start discussion, you know, I think we're interested in hearing ideas from this group. You know, it doesn't have to be something that we start with that is from a list. We're hoping to have that conversation with you all. But that being said, if you're hoping before we get into those discussions to get some information to help start your wheels spinning, that's certainly something that we can provide you with.
I was just reflecting on I participated with Gresham in a local housing solutions project that was run out of NYU last year. And they have a big list of potential strategies that are, of course, not Oregon specific. But what I can tell you is that an awful lot of what we'll talk about is on those lists. So there's a lot of different resources. Any other comments before we go on? All right, so we're going to go talk about the buildable lands inventory. So a buildable lands inventory, I try not to bring in too much stuff from Oregon's statewide planning program because it gets really geeky pretty quickly. But all of what we're doing here is really based on either state requirements, administrative rules, Oregon statutes, that kind of thing. So the Oregon Statewide Planning Goal 10, which is our housing goal, says that buildable lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels that are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households, Wilsonville households, and allow for flexibility of housing location, density, and type. So this is, part of what we're building on. This is a broad statement from Goal 10. It gets very detailed. As we're building as we've developed the buildable lands inventory, here are the steps, and we'll talk through a number of these steps. But we use data from City of Wilsonville, from Metro, the tax assessor, information about constraints, like physical constraints, like slopes, that kind of thing. We classify all of your land that is within the city into some mutually exclusive categories that we'll talk about in a few moments. We look at your constraints, so your physical constraints like floodplains. Then we do some verification ourselves. City staff have been through the inventory a few times. If you all have any comments on it, or City Council has any comments on it, then we'll look at those specific comments, and then we summarize the results. So this is a little iterative as we go through it. So we start with all of the land in the city that is has a comprehensive plan designation where housing is allowed, out with clear and objective standards. So those include your comprehensive plan designations that are all called residential, and then they have a density like 6 to 7 dwelling units per gross acre. It includes your residential neighborhood, which is Frog Pond, your town center, which is commercial as well as residential, your village, that's Villebois, your commercial lands, and then there's one industrial parcel here that is on the inventory because it is being planned for housing. It's like 2 or 3 acres. So we're not looking at all your industrial land, just that one particular piece of land. So this is what we start with. Obviously, a lot of this land, you can just see from this map, has development on it. So then we classify land into these mutually exclusive categories. So developed land, where you have existing housing that meets current zoning. These are unimproved lots that are relatively unlikely to redevelop over the 20-year period. Then you have vacant land that have no structures or buildings with very low improvement value, $10,000 or less. You have lots that are occupied by a use but contain enough land to be developed further in the current zone. We call that partially vacant. So if you imagine for a moment, say a 5-acre piece of land that has one house on it, obviously it's not fully vacant, but it could certainly be further subdivided. You've got little tiny undevelopable pieces that we're just making sure that you don't have little bits that just can't be developed. We're doing this in a GIS program, which has a tendency to give you little slivers of land that are much smaller than 3,000 square feet. And land that's in public ownership, so your state, your federal, your county, your city, your school district. If you had tribally owned land, it would fall into this category. We don't consider that developable unless it's been identified as a surplus. So if, for instance, in one community, their school district owned 60 acres of land that they didn't need. 60 acres is a lot. And they identified it as surplus, and through a different process with them, some strategy work, we worked with the city and set up a strategy for the city and the school district to work together to get that land developed, which I believe is in process. Also, we include in that public designation cemeteries, because while a cemetery looks like it's vacant, it's quite clearly not vacant. So that's what we've got there. Your constrained land are things like your FEMA floodway, your FEMA 100-year floodplain, your habitat conservation areas, your significant resource zoning, that's your SROZ. Slopes that are greater than 25%. While you can do development on slopes that are greater than 25%, for this project, we assume that that is undevelopable. It doesn't mean that development can't actually occur there. It just simply means that we're assuming that that doesn't have capacity. Your stream and floodplain protection area, and you've got a little bit of BPA right of way because you can't build in that right of way. So all of these areas are considered constrained and not available for development, even if they have vacant land. And so this one, it shows your unconstrained, vacant and partially vacant land by comprehensive plan designation. Now, you'll notice that most of your vacant land obviously is in Frog Pond. That's not surprising. We've identified a little bit of vacant land in town center. And as we'll talk about later, we're expecting redevelopment in town center. And so your development capacity in town center isn't entirely based on what land is vacant. We'll talk about that a while later in the meeting. And that amounts to about 64 acres of buildable land that are outside of your master planned areas. And then your master planned areas, most of which are Frog Pond, as well as town center, where you have more land that's vacant. So about 269 acres of land that's vacant. And we'll look at a little while from now how we turn that vacant land into capacity. And Kim, I believe after this meeting, we'll certainly be sharing this presentation with folks.
Yes, correct. Both the video link as well as the presentation.
So are there any comments on the inventory maps? If anybody wants a copy of the map, you can we can certainly provide that to you in a PDF so you can zoom in. One of the things you'll notice is that we don't include Villebois as a master planned area because Villebois is mostly developed. There's a little bit of capacity in Villebois, but not a whole lot. Yes, sir.
I have a question. When we're looking at these two areas and we're thinking about different communities that are gonna serve with this new housing, how well connected are these areas to transportation, to services? Will they have access to programming if they're located in these two areas? Town center, it's clear for me that it's available, right? But on the other option, is it something that is gonna be available, or it's going to be a challenge for different communities?
Get either Dan or Kim to talk about that. I think especially as it relates to Frog Pond.
Yeah, I'll start and then I might have Dan chime in on the Frog Pond piece specifically since he's been managing the planning work that is going on out there. The one thing I will note, the city operates its own transit system, which is kind of unique for other cities in the area, and it's a great asset for us. It gives us a lot of flexibility in how we route our transportation. It also is free within the city of Wilsonville. So it is operating, it's based out of the Wilsonville Transit Center parcel, which is where the TOD project is located, and is also the terminus of the West Line. And so Lee, her Wilsonville Community Sharing Office, they will actually be moving into that project. And so it's great because it's kind of a spoke and hub system. And so the services that Wilsonville Community Sharing provides will be available and accessible via transit, which does currently extend out to the Frog Pond area and will more robustly serve that area in the future. And as you know, town center is pretty well connected to the existing transportation system and is a little more located toward existing commercial services. And so Dan, is there anything else you would comment on with regard to Frog Pond?
No, I think connections are key. I mean, you see the dot of red there. We are trying to create some commercial a multi-use space. It is close to primary school and a middle school, as well as a high school, and well connected with trails and transit to those facilities. And also in terms of biking or walking or taking transit, is not that far from town center. So, for a new urban growth area on the edge, it is fairly well connected.
That's, I think, one of the challenges for Wilsonville is, aside from something like town center, your new urban growth areas are going to be on the edge. Luckily, you've got SMART, and so your transit agency, and so you have a different set of control than other cities do of transit, although transit's expensive. So, and I see that Caroline has her hand up.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that presentation. I was wondering if you had like an overlay on how this compares with the past inventory that the city's taken.
I don't. Creating that could be a little bit challenging, but we could certainly put the maps side by side, the technical part of creating that overlay. You could put the maps side by side. It's been a decade since I worked on the past project. But this is pretty consistent with what I remember of that. Villebois is obviously built out a lot more than it was back then. But this is what I would expect approximately.
Thank you.
I see that Robert has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Beth, the definition of buildable lands inventory may prevent you from including the type of land that I would propose, but I know like the city of Gresham in their inventory includes big box retailers that have been vacant for 5 to 10 years. There's a Kmart site that's right in their civic center area. Is that something that you could include in this study to identify large big box retailers that are unlikely to reopen as a type of buildable land for inventory? And then secondarily, in other cities, we've seen churches that have very large parking lots that are underutilized. And so both of those items may not fit under the definition, but I just thought I'd ask those questions.
So church land is included in the buildable lands inventory, but parking lots are considered developed. So it would only be the undeveloped part of the church land. Both of those are some flavor of redevelopment. So in town center, for instance, it's been a while since I talked to Dan and Kim about the Fries, for instance, and what might or might not be happening there. Of course, it's a privately owned parcel, I believe. So we can only do so much. But I think in town center, there is expectation of redevelopment of some of the closed spaces. Is that fair to say, Dan and Kim?
So that is correct, and being accounted for. I think what's interesting is, as I understand it, the way it's accounted for in this analysis is not so much via an acreage calculation based on what is mapped here. Because it's not vacant or partially vacant, it's a redevelopment land. So we have assumed in this work a number of residential units based on the planning work that was done in the town center plan. It's just not assigned to a specific parcel or a specific space, but as you'll see further in the presentation, the capacity for those units is being accounted for in the analysis that ECHO has done here.
And you have to be careful about mapping redevelopment, because of course redevelopment is very uncertain, and to a certain degree, if the owner of land disagrees, there's some issues with that. So if you have thoughts outside of town center for big box areas that you think should be considered for redevelopment, could I ask you to contact him or Dan about that? And then on churches, I honestly don't remember what discussion we've had about churches because it's been a little while. Certainly, have there been any churches that have reached out to the city where you think that they're interested in developing housing? I would imagine, given Kim and Dan's silence, that there haven't been necessarily.
It's, I think, and Dan can speak to this, I think we've included, I see a few parcels in here that I know that we included based on either just the known geography and or interest we've heard of. But of those, only one has come in and actually gone through any sort of land use process, and that is at a very preliminary level.
And so an HPS action or recommendation that's not quite an action could well be about working with communities of faith who own property, who want to develop some form of housing. And often at churches, you'll often see things like housing for people experiencing homelessness. And so there could be an action about having these discussions, or a recommendation that the city continue having these discussions, because I'm sure the city wouldn't turn away a church if it was interested in this. So that might be more of something that's less mapped in the buildable lands inventory and more of something to look out for those opportunities. Eric, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I get just kind of piggyback on Robert's comment. Land banking can be a huge tool for affordable housing developers. And given the current environment, they might have favorable financing, through NOAA or through the state. And so I don't know, those underused parcels can, I don't know if there's a way to identify them or have a working group that does outreach for the city with partners or whoever to try and identify potential sellers that might be interested in disposition.
My assessment would be that it would be more useful, rather than trying to perfect your buildable lands inventory, to have some sort of specific outreach that's ongoing about this topic, where maybe there's not something here now, but maybe in 3 years there's somebody who wants to do that kind of thing. Land banking is definitely a policy that will be discussed. So putting the city's effort into the actual work of it, rather than perfecting your buildable lands inventory at this point, is probably makes more sense. But if other people disagree, we can certainly have a discussion about that internally. So.
And I would just add, just to provide helpful context, this buildable lands inventory is really a tool for us to see. It's a tool to analyze land sufficiency. It is not a tool to map where you can and cannot build housing. And so I think in terms of assessing, where there is a lower barrier opportunity for housing to occur, and for us to figure out, do we have enough land based on those factors, that is really more of a key purpose for this tool. I think a lot of the strategies, and I'll start speaking to Commissioner Willard's question as well. Just because it's not mapped here, she is correct. We can still consider it in our strategy. It might be that there are lands. I can think of one example of some land that currently has an industrial comprehensive plan designation, but is surrounded by residential and vacant. So, maybe there's a strategy around that is worthy of consideration. And so that question, that assumption is correct. This is just one tool to help inform us, but as we think about strategies based on what we know, we can certainly think more broadly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to take us on because we've got quite a lot to go through here. So Nicole, you're going to take this up.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, we're going to get into the housing market and housing needs discussion. Wanted to start with just revisiting the steps in the actual HNCA process. So we start with inventorying the buildable land, which Beth just showed, and then identifying the capacity of land for housing development. on that land. And then we forecast new households, evaluate housing trends, and then seek to understand housing affordability. We then forecast the amount of types and new housing units needed to support population growth, considering those market and demographic trends and affordability factors, and eventually getting into that key question of whether Wilsonville has enough land to accommodate housing growth. So all of these elements are what make up the HNCA document, and that's kind of what we're going to discuss as we move through these slides going forward.
Nicole, I'm
slide.
gonna you for one moment and welcome Gloria, who may be with the Clackamas County Housing Authority.
Correct. Hi, everybody. Devin stepped in for the first hour, but I'm here now. I'm Gloria LaFleur with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So getting into before we get too far, I think it's important to define what we mean when we say needed housing. Cities are required to plan for needed housing, and this has a very specific definition in the ORS. And so what you'll see here is that needed housing includes most housing. It includes attached and detached single family housing, middle housing types, and multifamily housing for both owner and renter occupancy. Government assisted housing, mobile home and manufactured housing, both on manufactured housing parks and on individual lots, and then housing for farm workers as well. However, for some of these types, we don't actually forecast separate need like government housing or farm worker housing, because we're not required to do a specific forecast for those types. And housing for farm workers and government assisted housing can fit within these broader categories.
And
next
the type of housing that's needed housing that we didn't just now needed housing is housing for single room occupancy. So the idea of multiple small apartments or small units that have shared kitchen and bathroom facilities. That's also now a needed housing type.
Thank you, Beth. And so that as we're talking about these different housing types, this slide just shows what falls into these broader categories. And this will be helpful as we move through this process to understand that. There are single family detached. This includes things like manufactured and mobile homes, cottage housing, and then also ADUs, which are not listed here. Then you have townhouses, also known as single family attached. Then plexes, which are your duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and multifamily, which includes housing with 5 or more units per structure. Next slide, please. So when we look at the housing, types of housing in Wilsonville currently, and this slide is based on census data, we see that Wilsonville has a housing mix of which includes about 43% single family detached, 10% townhouses, 5% in plexes, and 42% in Wilsonville is multifamily with 5 or more units. So you can see here that Wilsonville does have a higher share of multifamily than both the Portland region, which consists of Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas counties, and the state. And I think that this really gets at what Kim was discussing earlier of Wilsonville as a community that has allowed a lot of flexible zoning and master planning, which has contributed to this greater diversity of housing type that we see here. Next slide, please. Thank you. When we look at tenure, and so that's people who own and rent, we see that ownership rates in Wilsonville has declined slightly since 2000, but not very much. So for the 2017 to 2021 period, that's the average period, 51% of units are owner occupied. And when we look at the type of unit and tenure, we see what I think is probably unsurprising. Most ownership housing is single family detached. And there's a decent amount of ownership housing in townhouses in Wilsonville. And then on the other side of that, with renter housing, most of your renters live in the larger multifamily housing. So that's your 5+ units. And then there's a little bit in your plexes, your townhouses, and in your single family.
And I would note that what we've just seen really reflects when Wilsonville was developed. You're a newer developing community than say city of Portland. and things like Villebois really hit the fact that you've got more townhouses than an awful lot of Oregon cities. So it's a more modern city in a lot of ways.
And then here we're looking at building permits that have been issued in Wilsonville over the past 10 years. And you can see that the total Wilsonville has issued an average of 222 building permits per year. About 73% of those were for single family detached housing, 17% were for townhouses, and 10% were for various multifamily housing types. And I think, you know, the key takeaway here is that this is different from the historical mix that we just looked at. It's the much greater share of single family and townhouses, and a smaller share of multifamily. And it's also, I think, important to mention right here too, that these are for building permits issued. And so the actual development and occupancy of those units do happen a little bit later. I'm going to pause for a second before I get into demographics in case there are questions. Okay, seeing none, let's keep going. So when you start to look at the academic and planning literature about how housing demand will shift based on different demographics, what you find is that these characteristics are most highly associated with the types of the characteristics that are most highly associated with the types of housing people live in are age. So the age of the adults in the household. And then you have household composition. So is it a single person household? Is it a two-person household? Do they have children? Do they not? And that kind of thing. And then income. And income is often the largest determiner of what type of housing people live in. So what we're showing on this slide is the life cycle for a person or multiple people as they kind of move through this housing continuum. It's probably a little bit stereotypical, but I think that some of the principles definitely hold. So young adults are much more likely to live in some form of multifamily housing or townhouses. And then if they can afford to, and as their family grows, they are more likely to move into some kind of single family detached housing, smaller often to start and growing as a family grows. And then we see at the older end of the life cycle, the potential for downsizing as well. And some of this is due to a desire to have less maintenance and upkeep. And some of it is due to need. So downsizing due to a disability or needing to move to a facility that offers services as people age. So the next few slides will focus on these kind of demographics. The first one we're looking at is population distribution by age. And we can see here that Wilsonville has a higher share of people between the age of 20 and 39. That's accounting for about 33% of Wilsonville's population. This is higher than we see in the Portland region and Oregon. And many people in this age group, consistent with what we just saw in the previous slide, is they're more likely to live in types of multifamily and townhouses. And this is also reflected in the higher share of those housing types that Wilsonville has. We also look at population by race and ethnicity. And so here we're looking at, you know, the growth in Hispanic and Latino households. Similar to what we see across Oregon, the share of households that were Hispanic or Latino grew from 12% to 13% in Wilsonville since 2010. That's a growth of about 1,073 people. And so growth in first and to a lesser extent, second and third generation Hispanic and Latino population and households, generally, they often need larger dwelling units to accommodate which is often larger household size. Sorry, my words are getting confused. But they're more likely to have children and more likely to live in multi-generational housing. And so when we're considering housing need, this is one of the factors that we also want to be aware of. Next slide, please. And then we look at commuting trends. So we know that Wilsonville is part of the Portland metro economy. And what you can see here is that about 1,800 people live and work in Wilsonville. About 18,600 people commute into Wilsonville for work. Many of them are commuting from cities like Portland and Salem, Beaverton, Tigard, those areas. And then 9,800 people live in Wilsonville and commute out for work. And many of them are going to places like Portland and Tualatin. So it's fairly common to have, this kind of high share of commuting throughout throughout the Portland metro region. But one thing we do consider when we're doing this type of work is, are there opportunities for people to live and work in Wilsonville if that is something that they would prefer? I'm going to pause again because I'm moving pretty fast. Go ahead.
And I'd add on that the commuting patterns are very reflective of where Wilsonville is located within the region. The southern part of the region, for your size, have quite a number of jobs in Wilsonville. And as Nicole said, commuting is just so common in the metro region.
And I am going to pause just for a second too, if there's any questions before I get into housing costs.
I'd imagine that commuting dynamic to shift as we all get used to hybrid and working from home and things like that. This might be a little outdated. It feels like could be outdated.
This is 2019 data. So yes, this was the most up to date that we had at the time. But Beth, you might have more knowledge on how some of that might look differently, or it's being captured in the data moving forward.
I think it's going to be hard to capture some of it in the data because so many people are working hybrid. And so you may see a little less in commuting and out commuting, but there's an awful lot of jobs that have to, the majority of jobs, you have to be there to do them. So your white collar jobs certainly are ones that are more likely to be fully remote or hybrid. So
yeah, it'd probably change the 9,800, but perhaps not the 18,000.
Yeah, I suspect so. So, yep.
Okay. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at median home sales price, and we can see here that the median housing sales price in Wilsonville this was in January 2024 was about $585,000. And when you're looking at it on this graph, it is kind of in the middle of the pack. It's higher than the overall Washington, Clackamas County, and Multnomah County, but it's lower than many of the comparison cities of Westland, Lake Oswego, Tigard, Tualatin. And so it's still important to point out that it's $585,000. And we'll talk about what that looks like in terms of income needed to afford that price shortly. But it is kind of where a lot of places are right now. And then also wanted to call out here that like other areas in the metro and across the state, home prices have increased substantially over the past decade. And we can see here between 2014 and 2024, the median home sales price in Wilsonville increased 72%. So from $340,000 to $585,000. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we also look at rent costs, and this data comes from CoStar, which does a rent survey of rental costs for multifamily housing. And what we can see is that multifamily housing asking prices in Wilsonville are on average about $1,733 is what we have for 2023. And this is an increase of about 58% since 2013. It has stayed relatively, what we're seeing in the data is that it's been relatively the same since 2021, but there was that big jump from 2020 to 2021. And then also noting here that this is just rent data. It does not include utility costs. And so as that becomes a part of the discussion, we think about affordability. And so you might consider adding $200 to $300 for utility costs on top of that rent as we move into the next discussion. Go ahead.
And
next slide, Beth.
That we have a slide about this, but when you look at change in incomes since about, I don't know, 2012 or 2014, it's somewhere around 25% to 30%, not adjusting for inflation, whereas rents 58%. Sales prices increased by, was it like 170 or 180%, so quite nearly doubling. So you can see very clearly that incomes have increased a little bit, rents have increased more, and then sales prices have really increased a lot. So that's driving the unaffordability. That's true in Wilsonville, and it's also true across the Portland region.
And so here we're looking at cost burden. And a household is said to be cost burdened if they spend 30% or more of their income on housing. And so what we can see on this slide is that about 19% of Wilsonville's households are cost burdened, and another 19% are severely cost burdened. And that means that they spend 50% or more of their income on housing costs. So cost burden in Wilsonville is higher than the comparable cities in the region that we have here. This is likely reflective of the fact that Wilsonville has a larger percentage of renter households who have higher rates of cost burden, which is actually on the next slide. You wanna?
So I just want to pause here for a moment and say that some communities, as we present to them this kind of information in a place like Gresham or Troutdale that have higher rates of cost burden, they interpret it as we're doing a bad job. I would actually interpret it as you're doing a better job than some of the places we're comparing you to. So I'm going to pick on West Lynn for a moment. West Lynn has the lowest rate of cost burden in this group. And is that because they're doing a better job, or because there's just no opportunity to live there and be cost burdened? You just can't afford to be cost burdened in West Lynn. And I would assert that it's harder to be cost burdened in West Lynn if you're low income. There's just not the opportunities. So take this not as a normative judgment, but as a, the set of facts that are connected with the type of housing that you have.
Thanks, Beth, for that additional context. So just a little bit more detail on this as well. When we talk about cost burden and income, we are talking about gross income, so income before taxes. And then when we're looking at renters' housing costs, that includes things like rent and basic utilities like water and electricity. And then if you're a homeowner, the home ownership costs include things like mortgage, interest, insurance, utilities. So when we look at cost burden by owners and renters in Wilsonville, we see that about a quarter of owners, just under a quarter of owners, are cost burdened, and over 50% of renters are cost burdened, and with 29% of renters being severely cost burdened. And I think, like Beth said, this is the higher rates of cost burden are that's common for cities in Oregon to have the renters have a higher share, and it's not necessarily just Wilsonville has a higher share of rental housing, and that is what is likely driving some of that higher cost burden rate.
And the changes in rent that we saw a few slides ago.
Yes, yeah. And so now this slide is just showing incomes in Wilsonville, and we can see that Wilsonville has a higher median income than the state, but lower than the county. And what's not shown here is that Wilsonville also has a lower median income than the comparison regions that we saw on the cost burden slide. So that's an important thing to note as well. When we're looking at household income distribution, the share of households making $100,000 in Wilsonville is similar to the Portland region, and greater than the state overall, but still about 55% of households in Wilsonville make less than $100,000, and 28% make less than $50,000. So this slide gets at housing affordability in the context of income. The median family income in Clackamas County for a family of four was $116,900, and that's 2024. The reason that we look at MFI broken into these different categories that you see here, 100%, 120%, 80%, is because it's a HUD standard, and it's based on income limits for things like housing choice vouchers. So looking at that, there's a lot going on in this graphic. So looking at this, you can see that for a household of four, at 100% of Clackamas County's median family income, they can afford about $2,900 in monthly rent, and a housing cost of about $320,000 to $380,000 without cost burdening themselves. And then as we step down that income spectrum, a household earning about 60% of MFI, so here it's 70,140, they can afford about 1,750 in rent, or a house at less than $228,000. And then a household at 30% of MFI can afford even less, or about 890 in monthly housing costs. And you're looking at houses that are 100, around that 100,000 mark for those households if they were interested in if they were able to buy. So when we put this in context of the median home sales price in Wilsonville, we can see that a household would need to earn about 180,000 or 154% of MFI to afford the median home sales price. And to afford the average rent, which we have listed here as 2,000, that's that 1,700 number with some basic utilities included, a household needs to earn about 80,000 or 68% of MFI.
So this is another way of explaining why you see so many households cost burdened.
Yeah, and this slide helps kind of explain it a little bit more as well. So looking at the actual households in Wilsonville, put into income level categories, it helps us understand better, what that distribution is. And so looking at this slide, if we start at the higher incomes, the 120% MFI, we see that there are about 25% of households in Wilsonville earning over 120% MFI, so over 140,000. And some of those households can afford the median home sales price, especially at those higher income levels, and all of them can afford the average rent. When you look at the 80 to 120% MFI bucket, about 22% of households in Wilsonville fall in that category. They can afford the average rents, but not the median sales price. And then as you just continue to move down, you have about 11% of households in that 60 to 80% MFI level. Some of those households can afford the average rent, but others cannot. They may be able to still afford market rate rents, but those would be at the below average amount. And then skipping over to the 30% MFI, about 18% of your households fall into this category. This is households that earn below 35,000. And so these are the folks, the people that are most at risk of becoming homeless. This is likely not capturing people that are homeless. These people likely are housed right now. Otherwise, they may not be captured in the census data, but they are the ones that are most at that edge and most likely to be the cost burdened. And then right next to them are the households earning between 30 and 60% MFI. So that's 35 to 70,000. And these households are also cannot afford what we see as the average rent in Wilsonville, and certainly not the median sales price. So I'm going to pause here if there are questions, and if Beth would like to add anything else.
Beth would like to add a little bit.
Okay.
So when you look and you think about housing need in the future, so quite clearly, over 40% of your households have income at or below 60% of median family income. And when you think about what kind of housing generally is newly built that meets that need, that's often government subsidized income restricted housing. You can get some other types of housing, sometimes things like mobile or manufactured homes. Sometimes will be affordable at that level. But there's not a lot that's newly built that isn't income restricted housing. So your housing authority, for instance. There's not a whole lot of market rate housing that's newly built that's affordable between 60 and 80% of median family income without some sort of subsidy, because it just isn't financially feasible. So this is likely households that are living in older multifamily housing that has depreciated some. Your newly built middle housing that's affordable to middle income households, some of this certainly, some of that multifamily is certainly built that's affordable here. And then newly built single family housing, it's likely going to be affordable to your high income households. So as we're thinking about the housing production strategy and producing new housing, this is the kind of context that we need to to remember as we're thinking about different strategies and what kind of strategies are needed. And then also remembering that preservation of your existing affordable housing, be it naturally occurring affordable housing or income restricted, those are really important strategies also when there are things you can do to support that. So this is some of the context that we'll be taking into the housing production strategy. And I will stop blabbling so you can ask questions if you have them.
I have a question, Beth.
Yes, ma'am.
And I asked this question because I don't know if I'll state it in the exact same way, but when we had a work session, I believe it was with City Council last year, where we presented some really high level demographic information. There was a question posed about people who might be on fixed incomes, let's say senior populations. And so they might actually have housing, or it might be more stable housing. And it's just that their income range is lower by virtue of age or position in life. And so I think the question, I don't know that we have a good way to tease this out, but is there a way to tease out, if there are populations that are, older, potentially living on a fixed income, and how they're feeding into this data versus those who might just be of employment age at the same income level, struggling to find housing?
Well, we've got some information, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, on this. I think we've got some information in the housing capacity analysis about income by age. I know we get that for cities that have a larger population than Wilsonville, mostly because the data is better, with a larger population. So we may have that. You can get some information about households that don't have a mortgage but are owners who are cost burdened. Those are the senior population that I'd worry about most. If you're cost burdened without a mortgage, you're in trouble probably. This data doesn't include information about accumulated wealth. That information just isn't available at the state level, or the county level, and certainly not at the city level. You can get a little bit of that information from the at the national level. It also doesn't include information about accumulated debt. So those are some issues that are hanging out there a little bit. So the way I would want to fill in that gap about our seniors who are on fixed incomes, who may be having difficulty, that would be a conversation, an interview or something like that with one of your service providers. Are there other questions? All right, we'll come back to a bunch of this data as we go along. You'll certainly see it in the housing needs and capacity analysis, but we'll be referring back to a lot of this as we go along. Councillor Dunwell.
And I do want to call out that we are 15 minutes from the end of our 2-hour allotted time, and I want to be considerate of everybody's time on a Thursday evening. So do you feel comfortable that we can wrap this up on time?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. So the preliminary housing forecast and land sufficiency. So your forecast of housing growth for the Wilsonville planning area, which is generally your Wilsonville city limits area, plus areas that are inside the metro urban growth boundary where Wilsonville is expected to grow and annex. We're looking at 2,815 new dwelling units, new households by 2045. That's based on Metro's 2045 household distributed forecast. That's the forecast that you have to use. So this is one of the numbers that we have to use. Okay. So then what kind of housing units are we talking about? So what kind of, where do we need these housing units in terms of plan designations? Well, we're looking at growth of about 45% of new housing in single family detached, about 15% in townhouses, 5% in duplex, and 35% in multifamily. And where we come up with those is looking at all the information that we just talked about and a bunch more information. and saying, okay, when you think about affordability, you need more housing that's middle income, and middle income doesn't equate to middle housing types, but there is some relationship. And you definitely need more housing that's affordable at your lower income levels, which is more likely to be multifamily and a few types of single family detached, maybe some middle housing. So what we're essentially saying is that most of your new housing will be divided by single family, single dwelling, detached or multifamily housing types, with some middle housing types mixed in. What matters is the next step of this, and I won't go on to that until I take Commissioner Barry's comment or question.
A quick question. So does any of that include manufactured homes?
Manufactured homes are under single family dwellings. Manufactured homes are certainly something that is commonly happening. It also includes things like prefabricated homes, which is another type of something that's kind of manufactured.
So is that something that Wilsonville would be considering?
I think you might be asking the question, is Wilsonville looking at more manufactured dwelling parks?
Yes.
And I don't have an answer to that. What I can tell you is that manufactured dwelling parks have been closing across the state rather than opening. But what I'm seeing and what I'm interested in understanding is how some of these new middle housing types or smaller housing types may impact that, especially things like prefabricated. So it may well be that we look at a strategy or two around manufactured homes, manufactured dwellings. It may also be that for the most part, the land is too expensive for it to be financially feasible.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, certainly. Jennifer.
There, found my mute button. This seems that it contradicts, I think it was House Bill 2001 that had an emphasis on middle housing.
No.
No?
You certainly allow middle housing, and you may get more middle housing than you're planning for right here. This is going to answer the question, do you have enough land to accommodate these different things? And the answer is yes, you've got enough land. Now, is that land going to be used for single dwellings or townhouses? It could be either. You know, we could be looking at in the future a little less single family detached housing and more townhouses or more of the plexes. Those are certainly possible. And because you allow it, there's not a barrier in terms of zoning that I know of right now to that happening. So
so these numbers then represent what we need or what we're likely to get?
It's a theoretical need.
Okay.
And in Wilsonville, I would say it's a balance between need and likely to get. And part of this is because of the way the fog pond areas have been planned. So yeah. Somebody else had their hand up, but they lowered it, so I'm going to go on. Okay. So then we have to do some stuff about density of new development, and that's only for your residential plan designations. We get to look at your master plans to figure out how much housing can be accommodated there. So, you know, you've got some vacant land in your residential 4 to 5, 67, 10 to 12. So we looked at the historical development densities in these areas and you know, came up with the average net density. A net density is density before accounting for rights of way. Then we accounted for rights of way based on the amount of land that's currently in rights of way, and that's things like roads and sidewalks or rights of way. And we came up with an average gross density, and those average growth densities happily match the comprehensive plan densities you're seeing there. So like the residential 6 to 7 at 7.7 dwelling units per net acre with a 20% right of way is 6.2 dwelling units per gross acre comp plan densities are in gross acres. And so that was when we weren't coming up with that, that made us look at some of what was going on in some of those areas more closely. So these are your future densities for the vacant land that are in these residential comprehensive plan densities, designations. And so here you can see, let's just ignore the 0 to 1 dwelling unit per acre because it's such an outlier and it's got so little land in it. But you know, in your 4 to 5, you've got 3 acres. Your 6 to 7, hey, you've got 14 acres there. At 6.2 dwelling units an acre, that's about 83 dwelling units. Most of your vacant land is in your 10 to 12 dwelling units per acre, at least vacant land for the comprehensive plan designations. So you're looking about 450 new dwelling units there. And then really, honestly, most of your capacity is in Frog Pond and Town Center. So Frog Pond, east and south and west, your master plans tell us how many dwelling units are planned for those. We know based on permit data how many have already been built, and that tells us what the remaining units to be built are. Town Center, that plan calls for about 880 dwelling units of redevelopment, and we're figuring that all of that is multifamily redevelopment. So that's where most of your multifamily capacity is in Town Center. So that means the Town Center plan actually being executed on over this next, 6 to 20 years is a really important piece of what Wilsonville's doing. And then our preliminary conclusion is that you've got enough land to accommodate growth with your largest surpluses in your Frog Pond east and south. And so essentially that means of that 2,800 new dwelling units, if some of them come in more as middle housing types, then certainly because of what you did with House Bill 2001, some of those could be built in Frog Pond east and south. And there's also some capacity in your residential 10 to 12 land. And then an awful lot of your multifamily capacity is in Town Center. So again, having that Town Center plan actually execute on is going to be an important piece of the housing production strategy, I think, and what happens in Wilsonville.
Okay, Beth, you have 8 minutes to wrap it up. I'm going to force a hard stop on the half hour.
That's fine. I'm good. We're down to next steps. So the housing production strategy, we're going to talk about this a lot more. I don't necessarily want to go into all of the details of it, but this is the subject of our next conversation. It's a 6-year action plan that identifies strategies to meet your housing needs, both in the near term and a little bit over the longer term. So 6-year action plan. What we're working on now is the contextualizing housing needs. So understanding the city's future housing need beyond what we just talked about, beyond just incomes. Developing strategies to meet those needs, incorporating affirmatively furthering fair housing principles, and then an evaluation of the strategies. And those 2 boxes are what most of this group is going to be talking about and where a lot of your input will be. And then you've got your final report with the actions that the city will implement. And then you do some annual and some midterm reporting and reflection. And then you start again in 6 years. So our next steps are finishing the NCA and starting on the housing production strategy. And then we've got a few other pieces there. Our next task force meeting, we're looking at late July or early August. I don't know if y'all brought your calendars. And I don't know, Kim, if we want to use this last 6 minutes or 5 minutes to talk about dates, or if you'd prefer to do a poll afterwards.
I would prefer to do a poll, just so we can capture a couple of other participants who weren't here. I will ask the question though, as I set up the poll. My sense from the first poll was that the late afternoon time slot generally worked well. Do we want to just go with something like 3:30, 5:30, 3 to 5, somewhere in that time frame? Okay. I will send out a doodle poll in the next couple of days so that we can hopefully arrive at a date sooner than later. So. And just one other caveat that I will note about the invitations that you got. So we do want to be careful as a group that is serving as an advisory group to both our planning commission and city council, that we are not creating any inadvertent meetings over calendar invites or email. And so we did send it out with blind carbon copies just to make sure that doesn't happen. That being said, if there is a preference to get these as calendar invites, we can do so as long as the group just agrees to not hit reply all on something and email the whole group, just to make sure we're not inadvertently holding a meeting. So if you all can do that, we can just send this directly as a calendar invite. Great.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for taking the time to attend this. I think the direction we're going is positive, and you've given us some great foundational data to begin to move forward. The one ask I might put forth to the group: would a pre-read be helpful for future meetings if there's any additional data that's going to be shared?
There's going to be more memoranda shared. So that'll give you some pre-read essentially.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all again in a few weeks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.